Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Rockefeller Institute of Government. My name is Laura Rabineau, and I'm the director of our Center for Law and Policy Solutions internship program. The CLPS internship is really designed to give undergraduate students their first hands-on, or in the case of the last couple of years, virtual, exposure to policy analysis and research. And each semester, the interns that work with us closely do their research alongside their instructor, gaining professional development and networking opportunities, and collecting and analyzing data for original research. The semester then culminates in the presentation of that research, which is why we're all here today. This semester's cohort worked with our interim director to conduct research on green infrastructure policy, and today we're really excited to hear from them. But first, let me welcome our interim director, Dr. Laura Decker, to introduce the cohort and their research. Dr. Decker.
Thank you all for being here today. It's been a pleasure working with these students this semester. They've taken on the challenge of educating themselves about the issues of stormwater and their specific case studies and green infrastructure. They come from Albany and Empire State College, and I can't emphasize enough how proud I am of them today. With that, I will pass that over to them for their presentation.
All right. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's having a good afternoon. Today, me and my fellow cohorts will be talking to you about green infrastructure, what it is, what's at stake, and how we intend to handle it. Many of us in our lives have seen flooding on a catastrophic scale, but most of us push this idea out of our heads as a possibility rather than the reality that it actually is. This is the reality that we're dealing with. On the left, you could see Albany from just 2 years ago, August 2020, with massive flooding that was as tall as cars. And on the right, you could see knee-high flooding in Toledo just last year. Evidently, the threat of flooding is here and causing damage now, with monumental flooding that is putting individual safety at risk. The problem is here, and the problem is occurring now. Not only is this affecting people's livelihoods physically, but fiscally as well. On the left, you could see the price of a flooded basement in Albany costing about $4,000. And on the right, you could see the cost of a flooded basement in Toledo at about $3,650. With floods occurring every 2 to 3 years at this point, this money will only add up and cause each citizen a fortune that lives in these areas. We must try and limit this as much as physically possible. Otherwise, this will be the albatross around our necks for years to come. Which leads us to today. I will start by describing what green infrastructure is, and then Amanda, my fellow cohort, will talk about the history of it. We will then shift to Ashley, who will talk about case studies in Toledo regarding infiltration systems and rainwater harvesting and storage. We will then transition over to Albany, in which Jesse will discuss the overflow abatement and flood mitigation project occurring in 2 distinct areas in Albany. And then we will finally conclude with Griffin, who will describe takeaways, possible futures, and recommendations. To begin, let us fully understand how this flooding occurs. As everyone knows, clouds cause precipitation that leads to water being built up in the streets of our cities and suburban areas. This rain is built up in the pipes, and there is not enough drainage to properly assess and stop rain from compiling into massive floods, which was shown before. This is what we have now, traditional gray infrastructure, my apologies, which is manufacturing systems of drainage to stop stormwater and filtrate rainwater from piling up in the streets of cities and counties. This is our attempt to replace natural processes that remove rain and precipitation from our built environment, which is the areas that we live in, such as cities and suburban towns. These are just 2 examples of gray infrastructure showing sewer drains and piping. While these projects are doing the task of removing rainwater, they're also damaging the environment as shown by the right image, and also requiring immense construction times as well. All these systems combine to create the combined sewer overflow, or CSOs, which collect rainwater runoffs, sewage, and wastewater into one pipe that is hastily removed. Which leads us to what we will be talking about today, green infrastructure. Green infrastructure is an approach to water management that protects, restores, and mimics natural processes in the water cycle. What this means in terms of stormwater mitigation is that water flows above ground, leading to extensive flooding and the spread of harmful pollutants into our waterways, such as rivers, lakes, and other bodies of water. These waterways must be protected, and to do so, we need to improve on old infrastructure, gray infrastructure, by implementing these new measures to stop these areas from receiving regular flooding, also known as these flood zones. This leads us to the implementation of green infrastructure itself, which is using nature in our cityscapes and urban environments in order to provide a filtration system for stormwater. This is the alternative to traditional gray infrastructure that we discussed before in terms of cost, aesthetic, and efficiency. This is the future of filtration, and this is what we need to implement in order to combat such harsh flooding. These are two projects that demonstrate the effectiveness and advantages of green infrastructure. The left project is a permeable pavement, which uses a more porous concrete to allow water to seep to the bottom of the pavement, which decreases water buildup by about 70% as opposed to regular concrete, which is only about 10%. The right project is a bioswale, which filters the water runoff into these boxed areas of greenery that then funnels the water into sewer systems that are then deposited into surface waters like pond, filtered as a result, as opposed to gray infrastructure. These are just two of many projects that embody green infrastructure. Others such as tree trenches, green roofs exist. With all that out of the way, my fellow cohort Amanda will now talk about the history of policy and federal involvement with green infrastructure in the United States.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this rainy day in New York. Maybe when you head outside afterwards, you'll notice some of the things that we're mentioning in this presentation. And in the next few slides, we're going to review some of the history of the laws, as Chris mentioned, that have been implemented by the federal government to address stormwater runoff and water pollutants that can occur because of water overflow. The Federal Water Pollution Act of 1948 is the first law that focused and raised awareness of the water pollution. The implementation of this law and its efforts are groundbreaking because it addressed the importance of protecting the waterways from hazardous contamination. It brought attention to the issues that were preventing some population from accessing clean water. The law directed states to implement water quality standards to ensure water safety. This means that each state was expected to monitor the water for pollutants. Standards must be set to meet specific requirements and criteria to ensure continuous water safety for consumption and usage. Unfortunately, the law was a lackluster success and was later amended to become part of the Clean Water Act in 1972. Next slide, please. The Clean Water Act of 1972 focused on measures to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's water by removing, stopping, or minimizing pollution such as raw sewage and toxic waste. There were 5 essential goals that were implemented to be overseen by the federal government. These goals are: 1, water pollution must be implemented to protect the ecosystem and waterways. 2, wastewater discharge permits must be acquired to limit and oversee water pollution distribution. 3, water quality standards must be conducted to test the safety of the water. Companies must provide risk management plans for dangerous toxic substance. That was the 4th. And 5th, records must be maintained to show compliance. Next slide, please. National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, also known as NPDES, is an important permit program that was developed under the Clean Water Act to manage pollution by directing point sources that discharge pollutants. Point sources can be detectable, restricted, and a concrete conveyance, which ranges from pipes and tunnels to channels. Just the same, point sources can also be interpreted as a designated dump area or site that individual, businesses, or organizations are authorized to release their hazardous waste. The implementation of this program is significant because it prevents mixtures and contamination of harmful pollutants into waterways like creeks, lakes, and rivers. More importantly, it limits the amount of hazardous waste that can be discharged into the water. Next slide, please. The Water Infrastructure Improvement Act, which was passed in 2019, is another important law that focuses on decreasing pollutants. Under this law, the federal government provides funding and issue permits to local municipalities to develop and administer strategies to integrate wastewater and stormwater management, such as developing ways of recycling and reusing water. While doing this, permittees are also encouraged to add green infrastructure to mimic natural processes to store, reuse, or reduce stormwater. This can also include permeable pavements and green roofs. Next slide, please. More recently, the bipartisan infrastructure law was enacted, and it originated from the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act, which was passed in 2021. This law is monumental in that it provided the largest investment in water infrastructure. More than $50 billion were designated to the EPA infrastructure programs, which is to be distributed for improvements. Of this money, more than $12 billion were delegated for clean water infrastructure and $1.8 billion to protecting regional waters. Additionally, $135 million were issued to improve the water. With this money, the EPA will oversee that the old water infrastructure be updated and maintained. Necessary safety improvements to waterway will also be made to encourage and promote recreational activities, such as swimming and fishing. Next slide, please. In the next blog, my cohorts will present their findings of 2 case studies. As mentioned, the first case study focuses on Toledo, Ohio, which borders the Maumee River, and the next case study centers around Albany, New York, and the Hudson River. An evaluation of best practices is used in these cities to address and incorporate green infrastructure, reduce stormwater runoff, overflow, and flooding will be provided. Recommendations how to move forward will also be discussed. Thank you. Here is Ashley, who will discuss the case study conducted in Toledo, Ohio.
Thank you, Amanda, and hello, everyone. Today, I will be discussing the case studies of green infrastructure in Toledo, Ohio. And Toledo is a front runner in green infrastructure that targets stormwater mitigation. Because of the severity of the issues they face, Toledo was forced to come up with effective solutions. Due to Toledo's issues of climate change aggravating current storm and wastewater problems, the city's main goal for investment in green infrastructure is to reduce the effect of ever-increasing annual precipitation and storm severity and frequency. Next slide, please. The city of Toledo is unique in location. It lies at a low, flat elevation and is in close proximity to Lake Erie and the Maumee River, which makes it very susceptible to flooding. Toledo also lies on what was once known as the Great Black Swamp. This means that Toledo is on major wetlands that are accustomed to heavy rain. However, unlike a swamp, where there was once trees, is now houses and buildings that cannot soak up the excess water. Next slide. In 1913, Ohio was hit with one of the greatest floods it has ever seen in its entire history. There were many days of heavy rainfall that caused a rise in water levels across the state. Following this major storm, the 1914 Ohio Conservancy Law was passed, which was the first law of its kind. It allowed the creation of regional agencies to provide flood protection for communities within the state. This was the start of Toledo's journey down the road of green infrastructure. Next, we see the Clean Water Act passed, as well as the creation of state EPAs, and following was the Toledo Waterways Initiative and two finished projects within Toledo. Next slide. The Ohio Environmental Protection Agency's Division of Surface Water administers permits under the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES. As for Toledo's major local policy, there is a Toledo Waterways Initiative. It is a $527 million program that will prevent 80% of the average overflow volume from getting into our waterways and is part of the city's long-term control plan to reduce combined sewer overflows. Next slide. An increase in Toledo's annual rainfall has caused systems like the Bayview wastewater treatment plant to reach capacity and consequently overflow. This overflow causes raw sewage to flow into Swan Creek, the Ottawa River, and the Maumee River. In 2021, it was reported to the Ohio EPA that as much as 150 million gallons of untreated wastewater were dumped in the Maumee. With the onslaught of changes in climate over the past 70 years, since 1950s, the city has seen a 41% increase in the total volume of rainfall and a 19.4% increase in precipitation. With the threat of climate change, current flooding within the city will only continue to worsen. Next slide. When asked about where she could see improvements in green infrastructure, Lauren Rush, a stormwater expert, said that the more you get people involved, the better it is for the community. Toledo has been very dedicated to engaging and educating the community in regards to green infrastructure and storm and wastewater mitigation. This has made it so that projects are easier because the community is involved and understands the importance of implementing green infrastructure. Next slide, please. The Maywood Avenue Stormwater Volume Reduction Project was a reconstruction of the neighborhood to accommodate bioswales, rain gardens, and a mix of other common green infrastructure practices. To reiterate what Chris said earlier, bioswales are an aesthetically pleasing alternative to storm sewers that use plants and soil mixtures to filter and treat stormwater. The city chose this project because in Toledo, sewage and stormwater are carried in the same pipes, and the large quantities of stormwater tend to overwork the system, leading to flooding in resident basements. The implementation of bioswales and rain gardens is a great way to mitigate the flood risk in flood-prone areas. The result of this project was a 64% reduction in the average stormwater runoff on Maywood Avenue. Next slide, please. The Swan Creek Sewer Separation Project was a large-scale project separating combined sewers within the Erie, Hamilton, Ewing, and Junction areas. The green infrastructure techniques used were biorecreation, retention, and bioswales as well. Bioretention areas are depressed areas that allow shallow ponding of stormwater runoff, and biorecreation is a bioretention field that can be used for recreation in drier conditions. This project was a necessity for the city of Toledo to reduce combined sewage overflows that impacted Swan Creek and the Maumee River. This project is one of many employed by the Toledo Waterways Initiative. Because the project was completed in 2019, a proper assessment of the benefits of this project has not been made yet. However, it is projected that the completion of the TWI would reduce the volume of combined sewer overflows by 77%, and by 2020, eliminate an estimated 650 million gallons of untreated wastewater from waterways. Next slide, please. Currently, the city of Toledo received $180.9 million in funding, and it's really interesting how they plan on using it. They are asking their citizens what they think should be done with the money, since they believe that a good portion of it could be used for replacing or repairing infrastructure. The money will be used as a part of the local Toledo Recovery Plan, which has a focus on youth, recreation, parks, green and healthy housing, job creation, economic development, and safe and livable neighborhoods. Looking at this list, it seems as though there is space for green infrastructure projects or programs. However, because this is up to the citizens, it's a gripping moment since there's no clue as to how they think the money should be delegated. Next slide. From Toledo, we can evaluate the impact of careful planning, proper identification of environmental issues, the essential component of engaging and educating the community, and the pros and cons of implementing smaller and larger projects on the environmental health of the city. From early, Toledo was able to identify the issues they have and make a cost-benefit analysis of different green infrastructure programs they can use to solve their issues. Overall, it's safe to say the success of Toledo's projects is all due to these four factors. And now I will pass it on to our fellow cohort, Jessie, and she will be discussing Albany.
Thank you, Ashley. So we also picked the city of Albany to focus on as a smaller case study that can be compared to Toledo, Ohio. The city of Albany is of particular interest because it's not only the capital of New York State, but also has the Hudson River running through the capital region. With this being a major waterway for the state of New York, implementing green infrastructure in Albany can provide a multitude of benefits for the city, such as flood reduction, reduced demand on stormwater drainage systems, and healthier streams and rivers. And again, the main goal of green infrastructure is to absorb or retain stormwater. And this is an important goal because polluted stormwater runs into nearby waterways such as the Hudson River. Next slide, please. So in 2008, the state DEC estimated that 36.2 billion in municipal wastewater infrastructure improvements were going to be needed over the following 20 years. And then as of 2011, there were 319 active state pollutant discharge elimination system permits. And then in 2014, there was an extreme flooding event in Albany that affected Hanson Alley, Reichman Alley, Elbron Place, and Quail Street, which led to the Quail Street Green Infrastructure Project, which was completed in March of 2017, and also the Hanson and Reichman Alley flood mitigation overflow abatement project that was completed in June of 2017. And then we also have the enactment of the New York State Clean Water Infrastructure Act in 2017, which allows for New York State to continue to implement green infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. So in 2008, the State Department of Environmental Conservation estimated that 36.2 billion in municipal wastewater infrastructure improvements were needed over the following 20 years, in part because New York State has some of the oldest water and wastewater systems in the United States. And as a result, many municipalities in the state must contend with aging infrastructure issues and the impacts of increased use and climate change. Next slide. And the need for improvements in Albany especially became apparent when the city of Albany experienced an extreme flooding event in 2014. The streets and residential homes of Hanson Alley, Elbron Place, and Reichman Alley were flooded by several feet of water and wastewater from combined sewer systems. The projects that have been put in place post-2014, including the Quail Street Green Infrastructure Project and the Hanson Alley and Reichman Alley Overflow Abatement and Flood Mitigation Project, have acted within the scope of underlying New York State and federal policies, such as the State Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, also known as SPDES, and the Clean Water Act. Next slide. The SPDES program has also been approved by the Environmental Protection Agency, specifically for the control of stormwater discharges in accordance with the Clean Water Act. The main difference between the two is that the SPDES program is broader in scope since it controls point source discharges to groundwaters as well as surface waters, in addition to providing funding as well. And the State Pollutant Discharge Elimination System program is designed to maintain New York's waters with reasonable standards of purity while eliminating pollution and maintaining the highest quality of water possible. And the New York State Clean Water Infrastructure Act of 2017 invested $4 billion in water infrastructure projects and water quality protection across the state. As a part of this act, it offers $400 million in grants for clean and drinking water projects during the 2021-2022 state fiscal year to municipalities with projects that protect public health or improve water quality. Next slide, please. In an interview with the New York regional contact from the EPA, Maureen Krudner, I had asked her if she could speak to what potential improvements could be made regarding policy and green infrastructure. And she said that from the policy end, looking at resiliency, New York State is actually trying to figure out how their regulations and these practices that are in their design manual, are they going to be good enough in 10 years? And she went on to explain that when it comes to green infrastructure, the mindset has become, how can we design this so it can be easily adapted in the future? Because the need that we have right now may not be the same need that we have 10 years from now. Next slide. And so the reason why Albany floods so easily and often is because the city's current systems aren't able to drain the water quick enough. And as a result, sewage and other pollutants from stormwater end up in waterways such as the Hudson River. As of 2011, Albany County had 319 active SPDES permits that focus on stormwater discharges. In addition, the Capital District Regional Planning Commission, along with local communities, developed an intermunicipal long-term control plan for combined sewer overflows to address wastewater discharges into the Hudson River. And there are 92 of these combined sewer overflow points in the Albany pool of the Hudson River. And the pollutants that are of concern in the capital region from stormwater runoff and wastewater overflows include bacteria, viruses, chlorine, trash, sediment, chemicals, and oil, all of which are detrimental to the region's waterways and human and ecological health. Next slide. So the first project that we looked at was the Quail Street Green Infrastructure Project. And for those of you that might not be familiar with the area, Quail Street is located in downtown Albany and typically houses many college students. The road also happens to be very narrow while simultaneously trying to accommodate for side street parking given the limited availability of off-street parking. The Quail Street Green Infrastructure Project runs along Quail Street from Madison Avenue to Central Avenue and was implemented to reduce stormwater flows to the combined sewer system, which will decrease the frequency and intensity of combined sewer overflow occurrences. The project is able to do this by collecting the first 3 inches of rainfall in porous pavement and storm sewers and directing the runoff into bioretention basins until the flow in the combined sewer system returns to its normal level. And so the annual volume captured of this project is 8.867 millions of gallons, and the annual percent of combined sewer overflow reduction is 0.22% pool-wide. And the funding for this project came from a Green Innovation Grant Program created by the New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation, which totaled 1.8 million, another 682,000 from the Albany Water Board, 293,000 from the city, and a $300,000 grant designated by the Office of State Assemblywoman Patricia Fahey. And this project acts in accordance with the state pollutant discharge elimination system permits. And in an interview with Neil O'Connor, the engineer supervisor for the Albany Water Department, when talking about the impacts of the Quail Street Green Infrastructure Project, he had said that instead of extreme flooding happening once every 5 years, it's going to happen once every 50. And he went on to further say that we don't necessarily solve flooding. We do the best that we can, but we can only design a pipe for a certain amount of flow. So we're trying to mitigate storms that we're seeing right now, but should climate change continue, who's to say that in 20 years from now, there's not going to be 6 inches of rain in 1 hour that the city is going to be dealing with. So while the project implemented on Quail Street has reduced the amount of extreme flooding events significantly, there's still a need to be conscious of the effects climate change can have on the amount of rainfall we may see in the future. Next slide. And the next project that we looked at was the overflow and flood mitigation project of Hanson Alley and Reichman Alley. And Hanson Alley is a small alleyway that serves as an access drive for residents to reach their driveways. Hanson Alley is located in the residential area between Hanson Avenue and Woodlawn Avenue, which is a low-lying region where large amounts of stormwater runoff often collects. So this project collects stormwater in new separate storm sewer pipes and is carried to an underground chamber system that is located beneath the Albany Central Babe Ruth baseball field. This allows for the reduction of flooding and runoff that would otherwise collect in combined sewers, leading to overflow. This project was completed in June of 2017 with future plans to design a pump station that uses collected rainwater for field irrigation. And the City of Albany and the Albany Water Board produced results for 3 inches of rain in 1 hour. And the total drainage area of this project was 13.7 acres, and with 7.4 acres of this being impervious, which is equivalent to 54%. And the maximum water surface for the design storm was 188 feet, and the maximum underground chamber volume was 776,500 gallons. And in a performance analysis of the Hanson Alley project, it was found that after a total inflow of 120,000 cubic feet, there was 0 cubic feet of wet weather flow, meaning there was 100% reduction with 0 cubic feet of discharge in wet weather. Next slide, please. The section of the project in Reichman Alley was designed to have the same effects as that of Hanson Alley and serves as an access drive for the driveways of residents and is located in the residential area between Ridgefield Street and Reichman Avenue, which is also a low-lying region. And this project also separates the stormwater runoff into separate storm sewer pipes to reduce flooding and runoff in combined sewers, and was also completed in June of 2017. And the City of Albany and the Albany Water Board also produced the results for 3 inches of rain in 1 hour for this project, with the total drainage area of 10.5 acres. 2.1 acres of this was impervious, which is equivalent to 20%. And the maximum water surface for the design storm was 184.5 feet. And the maximum wetland volume was 640,300 gallons. And in the performance analysis of the Reichman Alley project, it was found that after experiencing 1.59 inches of precipitation, there was 0 cubic feet of wet weather flow and 0 cubic feet of discharge. And the project as a whole is partially funded by the New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation, which includes a $450,000 grant from the Green Innovation Grant Program and a $600,000 Integrated Construction Solutions Grant. And similar to the Quail Street Green Infrastructure Project, the Hanson Alley and Reichman Alley Overflow Abatement and Flood Mitigation Project also acts in accordance with the SPDES permits. Next slide. So while the projects implemented in the capital region of New York have worked towards Albany's goal to mitigate flooding and stormwater runoff, all to create a more sustainable future, The question arises on this, if this will be enough given the effects climate change could have in the future. And because stormwater management is a necessary step in reducing pollution in our waterways, Albany should continue to seek out ways in which they can improve their stormwater management systems in order to ensure the health of waterways such as the Hudson River. And before the projects in Albany were implemented, the Hudson River Estuary Program had conducted a survey from December of 2011 to January of 2012 to analyze what barriers exist when it comes to implementing green infrastructure in the Hudson Valley. Of the 145 respondents from the survey, 23 were from Albany specifically, and the rest were from the surrounding area. And the survey indicates that of the total responses, cost, lack of knowledge, and unfamiliarity and resistance from local governments were the largest barriers to green infrastructure. This survey and the lack of respondents to it indicates that more funding, outreach, and continuous education are needed in order to implement and explore the possibilities of green infrastructure practices. The Water Department of the City of Albany has tried to combat these barriers by committing to continue implementing projects that increase the capacity of the combined sewer system to help reduce the frequency and intensity of flooding events. And when speaking to Joe Kofi, the Albany Water Commissioner, about the size of Albany's green infrastructure projects in comparison to Toledo's, he said, "Are we small or are we just trying to target the ultimate solution?" And he continued to describe it as similar to a jigsaw puzzle. So when the city is planning to do these projects, they're looking to target the problem areas rather than the city as a whole. If each project is a puzzle piece, then when looking at all the projects in combination with each other, we will see a more sustainable Albany as the completed puzzle. Mr. Kofi had said that whether it's 10 pieces or 100 pieces, we still want to get to that pretty picture at the end. And he also agreed that when it comes to green infrastructure, there's a lot that the cities can learn from each other. Toledo, Ohio was one of these cities that Albany had learned from when trying to tackle the issue of stormwater pollution. As Ashley said, this is because Toledo was a front runner in green infrastructure projects that target stormwater mitigation. When it comes to best practices, Mr. Kofi also agrees that the messaging, listening to the public's concerns and incorporating their suggestions, and being empathetic are all vital to a project's implementation. The questions now become, how can we educate the public on green infrastructure and its importance? And what can we take away from the success of projects in other cities? And with that, I will pass it off to Griffin, who will talk about policy recommendations.
Thank you, Jesse. Hi, everyone. I will be presenting the fourth and final part of this series, Albany and Toledo Review and Recommendations. We began this series with introducing green infrastructure and provided the precedents behind its implementation. We also introduced stormwater runoff and the issues associated with it, such as flooding and sewage overflows. We then offered specific case studies in Toledo, Ohio, and in Albany, New York. Through these studies, we learned that the implementation of green infrastructure requires a tailored approach and various resources. This entry aims to provide with some of the underlying practices and lessons learned for continuing these efforts. Next slide, please. So this chart is an overview of all the projects we looked at. As you can see, it breaks down the green infrastructure practices utilized in each, the funding sources, and the impact of each project. In Toledo, the Maywood Avenue project resulted in a 64% reduction of stormwater runoff on Maywood Ave. The other projects we looked at in Toledo, the Swan Creek North Sewer Separation, was a part of the Toledo Waterways Initiative, which was completed previously and had an overall goal of reducing stormwater runoff in Toledo. In Albany, the Quail Street Green Infrastructure Project, as well as the Hanson and Rankin Alley Project, each reduced stormwater runoff significantly, and they each took different methods to achieve this goal. As you can see with each project, they really do require various funding sources, and different green infrastructure practices were utilized. These are just some examples of the benefits of using green infrastructure to solve stormwater issues. Next slide, please. So through our research, we found that there are three main recommendations and takeaways when looking to implement green infrastructure. The first is to incorporate green infrastructure practices into grade planning, which was really done with every project we looked at. A second is to combine higher education program with community projects. And finally, we found there are several benefits to increasing public education as well as community engagement. Next slide, please. So each project we have examined has utilized green infrastructure in the Great Plain. Each project started from an issue such as poor drainage systems, flooding, something that just really needed to be solved. And while you could use conventional green infrastructure methods, a lot of green practices came into play. In Albany, the project on Reichman Alley and Hanson Alley did this. It involved an underground chamber to get better control of the pipes and to better control excess stormwater runoff. At the same time, they created a visually appealing wetland that stored more of the runoff. This was visible to the residents and in the area, which added a lot of character. On Quail Street, a lot of green infrastructure was implemented, such as the pavement used, the trees and other things that were planted, as well as the bioretention systems that were used. But they also had to use some conventional green infrastructure, such as parts of the sidewalks and roads. In Toledo, the same was done, but in a much different way. In the Maywood Avenue project, they utilized rain gardens, bioswales, and many other green factors to reduce stormwater runoff. This was also implemented in addition to some great practices. In the Swan Creek North Sewer Separation Project, the largest project we looked at, a lot was done underground with their piping system, but they also had a large-scale implementation of green infrastructure practices. They used many of the similar practices as the other projects and many different ones as well. Next slide, please. So another major takeaway from the project is utilizing higher education programs, such as with college or high schools, as community partners when completing these type of projects. The EPA is currently doing this with their Campus Rainworks Challenge program. College students are actually eligible to create and design their own green infrastructure projects specifically aimed at reducing stormwater issues and stormwater management. The first place winner of this wins $7,000 for students and $3,000 for faculty. The Quail Street Green Infrastructure Project was done in collaboration with St. Rose College, which is actually right near Quail Street, where a lot of their students live for housing. This brought several benefits to the project as well. In Toledo, the Maywood Avenue project actually collaborated with the Department of Agriculture's Green Jobs Corps Youth Program. This program was a good part of the project's overall funding source as well. And this program actually provides its students with hands-on training and trade skills in the environmental field. Next slide, please. So another major takeaway we found is to increase public education and community engagement. During Jesse's interview with the Albany Water Commissioner, he stressed the importance of empathy and listening to the community while trying to implement some of their suggestions whenever possible. During Ashley's phone call with Laura Rush, a stormwater expert, she also stressed the importance of doing similar things. The National Recreation and Park Association actually found that community engagement strengthens green infrastructure projects. They found that it allows residents to actually lend their own knowledge and specific insight. They also found that local residents can actually be the best at educating other residents on the city's histories and other issues that they may not know about. This association actually has conducted several initiatives to increase public outreach for green infrastructure related to stormwater management, and they have been seeing the benefits of this already. Community outreach and educating the public can bring huge benefits to every project, such as bringing new issues, new solutions to the forefront, helping projects even get started and completed, and making the community feel like their voices are heard, among any other things. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we found utilizing higher education as partners, expanding public outreach, and using green infrastructure practices while planning during great planning are vital to getting more green infrastructure practices to solve stormwater issues. As we've mentioned, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act brings an unprecedented amount of funding for wastewater and stormwater funding. So as Albany and Toledo have their current future plans where they are trying to solve these issues, like through the projects we've stated, there's also a lot of additional funding that has yet to be used. So we hope that some of these projects include some of the recommendations that we talked about to better combat stormwater runoff issues and to better utilize green infrastructure. And with that, I'll open the floor up to any questions or comments, and I'll give the floor over to Dr. Decker to moderate. Thank you all.
Thank you, Griffin. I invite any panelists or attendee of this panel to type their questions into Zoom. And I will read them off to hand them over to the cohort. If you all could introduce yourselves now. Dr. Schultz would like you to say your full name, your school, and your major so we can get to know you all a little bit better.
Okay, I'll start. My name is Christopher Evangelista. I am a sophomore at University of Albany, and I'm a criminal justice major with a film and poli-sci minor.
Okay, I'll go next. My name is Ashley Hall. I am a sophomore at the University of Albany, and I am also a criminal justice major with a minor in law and philosophy.
I'll go next. My name is Jessie Miller. I am a junior at the University of Albany. I am majoring in psychology and minoring in political science.
I'll go next. My name is Griffin Lynch. I'm a junior at the University of Albany. My major is political science with a concentration in security and statecraft, and my minor is history.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Udiram. I am a student. This is my last year at SUNY Empire State College. I'm working on my Bachelor's of Science in Public Affairs with a concentration in Public Health Administration and Policy.
This is a question for you all to answer. What findings most surprised you over the course of this semester? Christopher, why don't you start?
The most surprising thing was probably the, that's a very good question. I would probably have to say the amount of projects that were so interesting and fascinating that utilize so many different aspects, that were common in our day-to-day lives. For example, like at University of Albany, like you can see permeable pavement in the front, and now I know what that is. So it was very interesting to see how many different projects were using green infrastructure that I didn't even know about prior to this, obviously.
For me, I would say the most surprising thing is also very similar to what you said, Chris, about how it's really in our regular day lives, but it was also knowing how much like storm and wastewater problems there actually was. I didn't know how prevalent of an issue it was until I started doing this research.
Yeah, I agree with both Ashley and Chris. After doing this, I definitely noticed like the actual like green infrastructure practices that are in place that I never would have noticed before doing this. And then also it is crazy to find out how much pollution does end up into our waters and like how much flooding actually does occur.
I would say it was pretty fascinating to find out how this really does affect everybody, whether you notice it or not, whether it's people have to drive to work every day or people have to take the bus, people just want to go outside on a walk. It's really one of those issues that if you just let go on and you don't solve before it gets bad, then it'll just cost you more money in the end. So, and also finding all the new green infrastructure practices that can be used to solve these issues. I hope to see more of them being implemented all around the state.
For me, there were a lot of little things that, that didn't surprise me, but I was glad or excited to learn that the EPA and communities have been working on. But most importantly, next year is going to be 75 years since the Federal Water Pollution Act was implemented. And we've been, our government has been trying to address this issue of stormwater runoff for almost 75 years now. And there has been progress, and hopefully within the next few years, more significant progress will be made as well.
How were the municipalities able to fund these projects, and how can smaller localities incorporate green infrastructure? I'll pass this off to Ashley and Jessie to answer.
Okay, so the municipalities were able to acquire funding from the government as well as local institutions, and smaller municipalities could most likely do the same since the government they're really committed to trying to solve the issue of waste and stormwater.
Yeah, just to agree with that, a lot of it came from state funding, federal funding, and there was even some at the city level as well.
I would just add that A lot of municipalities can just look at specific grants and loans that they can apply to, because there's a lot of specific loans out there that are based on the particulars of each project.
Jesse, what would you say were some of how other smaller cities can take on small green infrastructure projects based on what you saw in Albany?
Well, based on what I've seen in Albany, I think community involvement is really important. From the research that I've done and the people that I've talked to, involving the community and getting their opinions is the most important factor, especially with smaller projects.
Great. And our last question for today is, how does the cost of these projects compare to gray infrastructure? I'll open this up to everybody in the panel.
I'll start. The cost is that green infrastructure is a lot cheaper from what I gather online, just because of the fact that it's a lot less requirement. It's a lot less construction for these large pipelines. It's a lot more of an individual effort as opposed to like a federal effort, as well as a federal effort. And I would probably say that, yes, it is much cheaper. It's much more aesthetically pleasing, and it's much more effective in general.
Great. Thank you everyone for being here today. We appreciate your attendance and your questions. Congratulations to the cohort. You did a great job. Thank you all.